Welcome to this Paper Connections investigation. Today, we examine a trending and widely read essay, the book that manipulated the 20th century. To fully set the stage and immerse us in the surroundings of this history, I will now read the author's prologue. Many summers ago, late one morning in a town in the Fergana Valley, the most fertile region of Central Asia, I sat down at the edge of a fountain and opened a thin French paperback. The book hit me like a hammer. I read it through the morning, kept reading and reflecting into the afternoon when the children came to splash in the spray, walked across the bazaar reading the last chapters, and finished it in a small restaurant after the long shadows had reached the square. The essay you are about to read is the one the fountain made me want to write. It has taken its time to find its way to the page.
The profound contrast established in that opening passage is quietly staggering once you uncover the true nature of the text the author is holding. Picture yourself sitting beside that tranquil fountain in the Fergana Valley. You are surrounded by the gentle sounds of water, the slow crawl of shadows across the cobblestones, the everyday commerce of a peaceful bazaar. It is a scene of profound stability. Yet the slim volume striking the author with the force of a hammer was forged in a crucible of absolute urban terror.
We are speaking, of course, about Gustave Le Bon and his monumental 1895 publication, Psychologie des Fous, which was translated into English as The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. To grasp why this text holds such immense destructive gravity, you must first step inside the mind of its creator. Gustave Le Bon was not some sheltered academic theorizing from the safety of a university library. He was a 54-year-old former cavalry surgeon.
He possessed the clinical, unflinching gaze of a medical professional who had witnessed the raw butchery of the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. More importantly, you have to consider that as a young man, he lived through the Paris Commune of 1871. Imagine the deep psychological scarring of that specific event. You are a bourgeois intellectual watching your beloved Paris literally tear itself apart.
You see neighbors erecting barricades constructed of torn-up cobblestones. You smell the persistent odor of cordite and burning buildings hanging in the air. You witness summary executions in the streets as revolutionary fervor completely consumes the populace. You watch the veneer of polite society evaporate, revealing a terrifying, primitive undercurrent.
Furthermore, he lived through the Boulanges crisis of 1889, watching the supposedly stable French Republic nearly collapse into a populist military dictatorship. Le Bon had looked directly into the abyss of human collective behavior. He concluded that civilization is an incredibly fragile illusion.
Placing Le Bon within that specific atmosphere of blood and barricades exposes the vast philosophical rift between his worldview and the prevailing sociology of his time. If you examine the late 19th century French intellectual establishment, you find a culture steeped in a radiant, almost naive optimism. The scholars and politicians of the era operated on a fundamental hypothesis regarding democracy.
They believed wholeheartedly in the progressive perfectibility of the human mind. The prevailing theory suggested that as you enfranchise citizens with the right to vote, as you build public schools and mandate civic education, the aggregate intelligence of the republic will naturally elevate. They envisioned a future where the masses would transform into a serene, reasoned electorate, carefully weighing policy and logic.
Le Bon shattered that comforting illusion with a diagnosis that was inherently dark and ruthlessly pessimistic. He argued that when you gather human beings together, they do not add up to a greater intellectual sum. It is not a matter of combining 50 smart people to get 50 times the intelligence. Instead, the very act of grouping them together triggers a catastrophic cognitive regression.
The educated, rational, morally upright citizen, the very moment they step into the physical proximity of a cheering or rioting mob, plummets down the evolutionary ladder. They revert to a state of primitive, impulsive instinct. To fully understand how he reached this chilling conclusion, we should consider his earlier scientific pursuits.
Before Le Bon turned his analytical lens on the Parisian working class, he spent years publishing monographs on the behavior of horses. He meticulously studied equestrian movement and mammalian herd dynamics. He observed how a sudden noise could trigger a wave of panic that completely bypassed any individual horse's cognition, rippling through the herd as pure, unfiltered kinetic energy.
He took that exact biological framework, the study of panicked herd animals under acute stress, and applied it directly to the supposedly enlightened voting citizens of the French Third Republic. Utilizing the biological lens of a panicked herd to analyze human democracy presents a deeply unsettling proposition for anyone who believes in the sovereignty of free will.
If we entertain Le Bon's premise, you are forced to abandon the comforting idea that your rationality is a permanent structural feature of your identity. Instead, your ability to reason is recast as a fragile, temporary condition that can be dissolved simply by standing too close to a large group of people. We might conceptualize Le Bon's theory of the crowd by comparing it to a highly volatile chemical reaction.
Imagine two distinct elements housed in separate glass vials on a laboratory bench. When kept in solitary isolation, each element is perfectly stable. You can measure their properties, predict their behavior, and understand their fundamental nature. You, as an isolated individual reading a book or making a private decision, are that stable element.
However, the moment you pour those two separate elements into a single beaker, a violent, irreversible reaction occurs. They completely lose their individual characteristics. They fuse instantly into an entirely new, highly combustible compound possessing its own distinct and dangerous properties. In Le Bon's architecture, the individual is the stable element, and the crowd is the volatile, unpredictable compound.
Yet we are obligated to apply rigorous critical scrutiny to this foundational premise. We must ask a deeply uncomfortable question about Le Bon himself. Was he genuinely presenting an objective, scientifically rigorous sociology, or are we simply reading the sophisticated rationalization of a terrified elitist? The late 19th century was a period of rapidly expanding suffrage and aggressive labor organization.
The working classes were demanding actual political agency. It is entirely plausible to suggest that Le Bon's clinical detachment, his medical vocabulary and equine comparisons, was nothing more than a carefully constructed masquerade. Perhaps this entire text was born not of scientific inquiry, but of a bourgeois intellectual's profound terror at the prospect of losing societal control to the burgeoning proletariat.
Pushing back against the purity of Le Bon's motives is essential because it requires us to separate the man's undeniable class prejudice from the terrifying durability of his mechanical observations. Whether his framework was born from a genuine pursuit of scientific truth or from the sheer terror of losing his bourgeois privileges, the anatomy of the crowd he described remains alarmingly precise.
We must transition from the theoretical origins of his fear and examine the specific clinical mechanics he identified. How does this chemical reaction actually occur within the architecture of the human brain? Le Bon posited that the transformation initiates with the total dissolution of moral inhibition.
Think about your life in isolation. You are constrained by a complex, invisible web of social expectations. You care about your reputation, you fear legal consequences, and you possess the analytic distance required to evaluate the long-term impact of your actions. But the moment you are submerged within the dense physical reality of a crowd, you are granted the intoxicating shield of anonymity.
When nobody knows your name, personal accountability evaporates. In the vacuum left by that evaporating accountability rushes a profound, adrenaline-fueled sense of invincibility. Once your analytic faculties are suspended by this intoxicating anonymity, the crowd becomes completely susceptible to manipulation.
Le Bon meticulously cataloged 3 distinct levers used to command this newly formed organism. First, affirmation. This is the bare, unqualified assertion of a proposition delivered entirely free from the burden of nuance, context, or supporting evidence. Second, repetition. This is the relentless echoing of that exact same assertion until it ceases to be a debatable point and calcifies in the mind as an undeniable environmental fact.
Third, contagion. This is the rapid emotional propagation of this newly engineered reality through the mass. It spreads not through logical persuasion, but through the unspoken, resonant proof that everyone else in your immediate vicinity believes it to be absolutely true.
The sheer terror embedded within these mechanics is that they are designed specifically to bypass the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical reasoning center of your brain. Le Bon warned that the crowd does not and cannot reason. It processes information entirely in images, much like a dreaming mind constructing a nighttime narrative. In a dream, you accept bizarre scenarios without demanding logical consistency, and you experience vastly exaggerated emotional states without contradiction. The crowd operates precisely in this vulnerable dream state.
It is a horrifying prospect to consider the total loss of your sovereign mind to the collective organism of the mob. We see this theoretical framework leap off the pages of Le Bon's text and manifest with chilling precision in the historical record. Consider the meticulously documented case of Ron Jones and his 1967 third-wave experiment in Palo Alto, California.
The essay outlines this event with devastating clarity, and it serves as a perfect laboratory demonstration of Le Bon's levers. A high school history teacher found himself utterly incapable of explaining to his students how the civilized German populace could have willingly succumbed to the barbarism of fascism. Unable to explain it intellectually, he decided to demonstrate the mechanism experientially.
Over the course of a mere 5 days, Jones systematically applied Le Bon's levers to a classroom of teenagers. He introduced strict, arbitrary discipline. He demanded repetitive physical gestures, such as a sharp, fixed salute. He engineered a highly contagious sense of elite, exclusive group identity.
By the third day, these ordinary educated American high school juniors were willingly wearing armbands and reporting their own friends for minor deviations from the newly established norm. By the fifth day, the classroom had metastasized into a terrifying, fully functioning fascist microcosm.
Jones had to abruptly terminate the experiment, revealing to the visibly shaken students that they had flawlessly recreated the very psychology they had so arrogantly questioned. The most haunting conclusion to draw from Palo Alto is that their education offered zero protection. These were bright, inquisitive students trained in critical thinking, yet the moment they were submerged in the suggestive environment of the crowd, their critical faculties instantly dissolved.
The Palo Alto experiment forces us to turn our critical gaze away from the history books and confront a deeply uncomfortable reality concerning the architecture of our modern information ecosystems. If you carefully examine the mechanics Le Bon identified, affirmation, repetition, and contagion, you can map them perfectly onto the foundational design of contemporary algorithmic social media feeds.
The modern digital platform is not merely a neutral tool facilitating human communication. It is an infinitely scrolling, inescapable loop of those exact three levers, optimized by supercomputers to continuously bypass your rational faculties. Consider your own daily experience.
The algorithm affirms your latent biases by feeding you content that aligns with your pre-existing worldview, rarely demanding empirical evidence. It repeats those affirmations relentlessly, ensuring they dominate your entire visual field until they feel like universal consensus. Finally, it weaponizes contagion through the explicit metrics of engagement.
When you see a post with tens of thousands of shares and retweets, it proves to your primitive mammalian brain that the tribe agrees. You feel the emotional pull to conform before your logical brain can even assess the claim. It is a synthetic, globalized version of the physical crowd Le Bon observed in the streets of Paris.
This observation brings us to a critical philosophical juncture regarding the core argument presented by the author of the essay. The author suggests that while formal education cannot protect you from the crowd, the explicit awareness of the mechanism might act as a form of inoculation. The conscious act of recognizing the levers of affirmation and repetition as they engage upon you.
We must challenge that premise vigorously. Does mere awareness truly protect the sovereign mind? If this chemical reaction is biologically hardwired into our species through millions of years of evolution, as Le Bon suggests, is it actually possible to stand inside the beaker, watch the compound change color around you, and somehow prevent yourself from reacting?
Or is the illusion of awareness just another comforting image the dreaming crowd conjures to soothe its own profound anxiety? Interrogating that concept of inoculation leads us directly out of the theoretical realm and into the darkest, most violent corridors of the 20th century.
If these biological levers operate with such terrifying efficiency on a group of high school students in California, we are compelled to examine what occurs when these tools are actively adopted by autocratic operators. Operators who command the vast industrialized resources of modern nation-states.
The essay provides meticulous documentation of the primary sources linking Le Bon's 1895 paperback directly to the central architects of totalitarianism. Let us examine the documentary evidence surrounding Benito Mussolini. The historical record is not merely suggestive, it is alarmingly explicit.
During his 1932 interviews with the biographer Emil Ludwig, conducted in the grand halls of the Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini was asked a direct question about which book had shaped him most profoundly. Passing over the grand traditions of Roman antiquity, ignoring Machiavelli, and bypassing heavy German philosophy, the fascist dictator explicitly named Le Bon's Psychologie des Fous.
We must also consider the deeply unsettling recent scholarship of Elena Bovo. She unearthed 13 letters written directly by Mussolini to the elderly Gustave Le Bon between 1922 and 1931. Think about the psychological dynamics of that correspondence for a moment.
You have a rising, violent autocrat writing deferential letters to a French sociologist, acknowledging him as the master who provided his operational blueprint. Furthermore, the essay traces this identical framework to a cold Munich prison cell in 1924.
The 2016 critical edition of Mein Kampf, published by the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, heavily footnotes Hitler's absorption of Le Bonian categories. Whether he studied the primary French text or whether he absorbed the concepts through Julius Rossbach's 1919 nationalist pamphlet, Die Massenseele, the mechanism of mass manipulation was deeply integrated into his political methodology.
The translation of that theoretical framework from the pages of a book into physical reality produced some of the most haunting and destructive spectacles in recorded history. We must visualize the application of these levers when deployed at a fully industrial scale, most notably during the 1934 Reichsparteitag in Nuremberg.
The architect Albert Speer designed a structural masterpiece of psychological manipulation that became known as the Cathedral of Light. Picture the sheer, overwhelming sensory dominance of this construct. Imagine standing on the Zeppelinfeld on a freezing September night.
Speer requisitioned 152 anti-aircraft searchlights from the Luftwaffe. He positioned them precisely 12 meters apart, completely encircling the massive parade grounds. When the switch was thrown, they projected solid pillars of brilliant, blinding light miles into the night sky, creating a colossal, immaterial architecture.
Witnesses described it as a cathedral made entirely of ice. Inside this luminous, inescapable cage, hundreds of thousands of individuals were subjected to a masterclass in Lebonian manipulation. The darkness surrounding the field, the rhythmic, thunderous chanting echoing off the grandstands, the flickering torches, and the meticulously timed arrival of the leader were not merely aesthetic choices.
They were engineered psychological weapons. They were designed to systematically overwhelm and permanently suspend the analytic faculties of the assembled masses.
Yes.
The levers of affirmation, repetition, and contagion were amplified to a deafening volume, transforming a weary populace into a single, pliable organism stripped of all individual reason.
And yet, while the Cathedral of Light demonstrates the terrifying efficacy of these levers applied to a mass of hundreds of thousands, the essay reveals an equally chilling, vastly more intimate application of the framework. We are presented with the astonishing archival discovery of Mussolini's June 1933 handwritten letter to the newly inaugurated American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Uncovered from the private files of FDR's secretary, Grace Tully, this document is a masterclass in psychological manipulation specifically tailored for an audience of one. Mussolini did not utilize standard bureaucratic diplomatic channels. He bypassed the foreign ministries entirely, sending the letter via the personal pouch of the American ambassador.
Picture the physical document itself. It consists of 4 pages written in the dictator's own distinct right slanting hand, conspicuously lacking the formal rigidity of a dictated state communication. He utilized the heavy imperial eagle letterhead of the Capo del Governo.
Every solitary choice of the creation of that document was a calculated application of Le Bon's principles. He utilized affirmation by expressing deep personal admiration for Roosevelt without any conditional hedging or diplomatic qualifiers. He utilized repetition by returning continually, paragraph after paragraph, to his urgent desire for a personal meeting.
The very intimacy of the handwritten script served as the instrument of contagion, fostering a false sense of personal connection. Furthermore, the circumvention of standard diplomatic bureaucracy conferred immense prestige upon Roosevelt, heavily flattering his ego. It was the precise mechanics of the rioting crowd, distilled, concentrated, and focused entirely onto the psychology of a single, powerful individual.
That letter functions much like a dark magician, privately revealing his sleight-of-hand techniques to a fellow illusionist behind closed doors. The terrifying difference is that the stakes do not involve a parlor trick, but the geopolitical architecture of the entire globe. This application of the levers by Mussolini brings us to a profound historical complication presented within the essay.
It is a case study that completely shatters the comforting binary assumption that Le Bon's tools are exclusively the domain of genocidal tyrants. We are introduced to the figure of Abdullah Cevdet, the exiled Kurdish Ottoman physician who painstakingly translated Le Bon's work into Turkish.
His intellectual journal, Ijtihad, served as the primary conduit, carrying this psychological framework to the generation of Ottoman military officers who would eventually found the modern Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk possessed these very translations in his private library.
Between 1923 and 1938, the founders of the Turkish Republic utilized Lebonian techniques to engineer a sweeping, top-down, authoritarian cultural revolution. They sought to yank an entire society into modernity. They replaced the ancient Arabic alphabet with a Latin one, They enforced secular civil law modeled directly on the Swiss Code.
To achieve this unprecedented societal transformation, they applied the exact same levers of affirmation, repetition, and contagion that were concurrently being utilized in Rome and Berlin. This history forces us into a deeply uncomfortable philosophical corner. It forces us to realize that the framework itself is entirely morally agnostic.
It is merely a clinical description of biological physics. It dictates precisely how to move a population, but it remains profoundly, terrifyingly silent on the destination. We must rigorously evaluate the ethical dissonance that this historical reality provokes within us.
Are we philosophically permitted to draw an equivalence between Ataturk's application of these psychological levers to enforce modernization and women's enfranchisement, and the application of those identical levers by the Nazi regime to execute a continent-wide genocide? It resurrects the ancient, perilous philosophical debate of whether the ends can ever truly justify manipulative means.
If a population is shepherded toward a demonstrably beneficial outcome, such as widespread literacy and integration into the global economy, does it matter that they were driven there through the deliberate suspension of their rational faculties? The essay points to a deeply melancholic conclusion regarding this ethical dilemma.
The crowd that enthusiastically embraced the new Latin alphabet in 1928, burning their old texts in a frenzy of progressive contagion, was the exact same biological organism that would have enthusiastically embraced catastrophic violence had the leader demanded it. The profound tragedy of the Libonian mechanism is that it inherently strips the populace of its agency.
The crowd does not engage in a reasoned deliberation of its own best interests. It does not weigh the pros and cons of secular civil law. It is not persuaded. It is simply moved by the current of contagion. The structural vulnerability remains permanent within the human condition, regardless of the benevolence or malevolence of the operator currently holding the levers.
That structural vulnerability, once its immense power was definitively proven on the political stages of Europe and Asia Minor, inevitably migrated across the Atlantic. It found a new, immensely profitable application in a society that prided itself on individualism. The realization that the framework is morally agnostic naturally led to its adaptation for capitalist enterprise.
We transition now to Madison Avenue and the silent, highly lucrative conquest of the free, democratic consumer. The bridge connecting the authoritarian political crowd to the American commercial market was built almost entirely by one man, Edward Bernays. Born in Vienna, Bernays carried an extraordinary intellectual lineage.
He was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud. However, his most consequential contribution to the 20th century was not in the realm of clinical psychoanalysis, but in recognizing that the techniques of mass persuasion could be fully industrialized for corporate profit.
During the First World War, Bernays served on the Creel Committee, the massive government apparatus responsible for engineering American public support for entering the European conflict. Having witnessed firsthand the staggering success of mobilizing a previously isolationist populace using emotional contagion and repetitive imagery, Bernays returned to peacetime New York and established an entirely new commercial discipline.
He called it public relations. In his seminal 1928 textbook boldly titled Propaganda, Bernays was remarkably transparent about his intellectual debts. He explicitly named Wilfred Trotter, his uncle Sigmund Freud, and crucially Gustave Le Bon.
Bernays realized a terrifying truth. The mass democratic public of a capitalist society would respond to the exact same levers of affirmation, repetition, and contagion that motivated the political mobs of Paris or Rome. The target simply shifted from adopting a political ideology to purchasing consumer goods.
The theoretical foundation laid by Bernays culminated in one of the most clinically effective psychological operations in corporate history, the 1929 Torches of Freedom campaign. The American Tobacco Company faced a significant barrier to their profit expansion. The social mores of the era strictly prohibited women from smoking in public.
It was deemed unseemly and inappropriate. They hired Bernays to eradicate this cultural taboo. His solution was a masterpiece of Libonian manipulation. Bernays orchestrated a highly visible spectacle during the Easter parade on Fifth Avenue. He arranged for a group of 30 glamorous debutantes to dramatically light Lucky Strike cigarettes in perfect unison directly in front of the assembled press cameras.
He understood that a rational argument about the quality of the tobacco would fail. He did not sell the chemical composition of the product. He sold a potent emotional image. He famously branded the cigarettes as torches of freedom, successfully grafting the commercial product directly onto the rising, legitimate political sentiment of female emancipation.
To truly grasp the sophistication of this operation, you must analyze the visual culture it spawned over the subsequent decade. Consider the glamorous girl in red photographs captured by Nicholas Murray. When you look at these images, they do not read as crude, pushy advertisements. They masquerade as disinterested, high-end fashion photography.
Yet beneath their elegant, colorful surface, they were actively weaponizing deep psychological contagion. They completely bypassed rational arguments regarding the financial cost or the physical effects of smoking. Instead, they firmly established an emotional, visual equation deeply within the public subconscious. Smoking equals modernity, autonomy, and sophisticated beauty.
The sheer scale of the consequences stemming from that specific public relations campaign demands our utmost critical attention. The essay notes the World Health Organization's estimation regarding the 20th century death toll directly attributed to tobacco consumption. We are speaking of tens of millions of human lives lost.
A public health catastrophe of unfathomable proportions, initiated and accelerated significantly by a carefully engineered psychological trigger based on the behavioral studies of panicked horses. Late in his extraordinarily long life, Bernays himself expressed profound regret, stating that had he known the severe medical consequences in 1928, he would have categorically refused the commission.
This forces a deeply uncomfortable philosophical debate regarding the fundamental nature of consumer democracies. We operate under the foundational assumption that a capitalist democracy represents the absolute pinnacle of individual liberty. We fiercely believe that we make rational, sovereign choices about the goods we purchase, the lifestyles we adopt, and the values we espouse.
Yet if the desires driving those choices are artificially implanted by corporate operators utilizing the exact same psychological frameworks developed to study primitive mobs, we must pause and ask ourselves a critical question. Are you actually free? Or is your perception of autonomy merely the most successful, pervasive illusion ever engineered by the public relations industry?
We are confronted with the terrifying possibility that we are not exercising true freedom, but merely experiencing a highly curated, thoroughly commercialized form of totalitarian manipulation, where the chains are made of branded desires rather than iron. The mechanics of the Torches of Freedom campaign operate structurally like a perfectly executed psychological heist.
Bernays recognized that a frontal assault on the social taboo, trying to logically argue that women should smoke, would fail against entrenched rational resistance. Instead, he utilized the profoundly legitimate, emotionally resonant feminist movement as his getaway vehicle.
He hijacked an authentic, deep-seated desire for political equality and seamlessly substituted a highly addictive consumer product in its place. The public subconscious was robbed of its critical discernment before it even registered that a commercial transaction had occurred. However, we must subject Bernays' legacy to further critical pushback.
Did Edward Bernays genuinely invent a new, rigorous science of manipulation? Or did he simply observe the instinctive, charismatic demagoguery that tribal leaders, merchants, and priests have employed for millennia and merely slap a shiny, palatable corporate label on it?
While Le Bon cataloged the levers and Bernays systematized them into corporate textbooks, one could forcefully argue that the manipulation of the human collective is as ancient as the species itself. What Bernays truly invented was not the mechanism of persuasion, but the bureaucratic, scalable industrialization of that mechanism. He created the methodologies allowing it to be deployed persistently across the entire fabric of modern democratic life.
The pervasive, inescapable nature of that industrialized mechanism leads us away from the grand public stages of political rallies and advertising avenues. It brings us into the deeply intimate historical struggle for personal survival and subsequently into the cold mathematical architecture of our financial systems.
We turn our attention to the fifth reader of Le Bon's framework, highlighted in the essay, Princess Marie Bonaparte. Her lineage alone places her at the very center of European history, being a great-great-niece of the Emperor Napoleon. However, her true historical weight is anchored in her profound relationship with Sigmund Freud.
She began as his patient, evolved into a close confidant, and ultimately became the financial and diplomatic savior of the Freud family. We must vividly visualize the harrowing events of March 1938, the Anschluss, the German army crossing the border into Austria. The essay paints a terrifying, visceral picture of Vienna on that fateful Saturday morning.
Imagine looking down from a balcony onto the Ringstrasse. You see the open Mercedes slowly navigating the broad avenue, flanked by enormous, ecstatic, weeping crowds. In that single, horrifying, historical moment, the abstract levers of Le Bon's theory materialized in the physical world with devastating force.
The enthusiastic, synchronized salutes were the pure, physical affirmation of the Reich's power. The preceding 12 years of relentless, aggressive nationalist agitation provided the foundation of repetition. The joyous, weeping faces of the populace swept up in a frenzy of nationalistic fervor were the pure embodiment of effective contagion.
The mechanism was running flawlessly in real time, functioning as a massive biological machine preparing to systematically consume the vulnerable individuals trapped within its radius. The sheer vulnerability of the isolated individual against the massive, mobilized weight of the crowd is starkly documented in the archival materials related to the Freud family's desperate escape.
Let us deeply examine the primary document held at the Freud Museum in London, the Reichsfluchtsteuer, or the Reich Flight Tax Assessment. We must look beyond the mere historical narrative of the rescue and confront the terrifying bureaucratic banality of the document itself. Picture a single sheet of paper typed in stark, formal German, assessing a ruinous levy of 31,329 Reichsmarks upon an elderly, ailing scholar.
This was not a chaotic, violent looting by a rioting mob. It was methodical, legalized, administrative extortion. The totalitarian state, having successfully weaponized the emotional contagion of the crowd to secure absolute political power, then utilized the cold, dispassionate apparatus of tax law to meticulously strip its victims of their resources before permitting them to flee for their lives.
Princess Marie Bonaparte utilized her immense Monegasque fortune to satisfy this demand in full, effectively purchasing the physical survival of the founder of psychoanalysis. The historiographical research presented in the essay, drawing heavily upon works like Andrew Nagorsky's Saving Freud, forces us to recognize a terrifying continuity.
The bureaucratic instrument designed to financially bleed desperate refugees in 1938 did not simply vanish into the ashes of history with the fall of the regime. It mutated and adapted. The essay traces its evolution directly into modern exit taxes, such as the contemporary German Wegzugsbesteuerung.
This raises a chilling philosophical contention formulated by the author. A free society does not, in the long view, tax the door. The persistence of such laws suggests an enduring, latent assumption by the state that it holds ultimate, unbreakable dominion over the individual's capital and movement, a dominion originally secured by the roaring crowds of the 30s.
That type document, the Reichsfluchtsteuer, functions as a physical, tangible manifestation of the crowd's immense toll on the solitary individual. It is quite literally a bureaucratic receipt for the systemic destruction of a human life and legacy. It represents the precise intersection where the psychological frenzy of the masses crystallizes into the cold mathematics of state persecution.
This intersection of human psychology and numerical valuation leads us directly to the final arena where Le Bon's framework asserts its dominance, the global financial markets. The essay introduces Bernard Baruch, an incredibly astute financial operator who recognized a profound truth. He realized that the crowd behaving irrationally in the political square behaves identically when placed on the trading floor.
Baruch had deeply studied Charles Mackay's accounts of historical financial manias, texts which Le Bon himself had cited as foundational. Observing the speculative euphoria gripping Wall Street in the late summer of 1929, Baruch recognized the clear, undeniable engagement of the Le Bonian levers.
He saw the bare affirmations of endless prosperity. He saw the endless repetition of stock tips from shoeshine boys to bankers. He felt the blind, intoxicating contagion of the mass chasing wealth. Recognizing the architecture of the mob, he liquidated his massive positions in the equity market just weeks before the catastrophic crash of October 1929.
He preserved his immense wealth while the irrational crowd was financially annihilated. The lineage of Baruch's realization that financial markets are not driven by rational actors meticulously weighing data, but by the raw emotional contagion of the herd, is traced meticulously through the intellectual history of the subsequent century.
We see it clearly in John Kenneth Galbraith's Postmortems of Financial Euphoria, where he outlines the predictable cycle of illusion and despair. We see it formalized under strict laboratory conditions by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose Nobel Prize-winning work on prospect theory empirically validated the irrational cognitive biases that Le Bon observed phenomenologically in the streets.
We see it in the complex mathematics of Benoit Mandelbrot, who proved that market risks are not distributed in predictable, comforting bell curves, but rather feature catastrophic, fat-tailed events driven entirely by human panic. Nassim Nicholas Taleb brought this terrifying reality directly to the halls of Congress following the 2008 systemic collapse.
And we see the mechanism operating with flawless, terrifying speed in the present digital era. Think of the algorithmic chaos of the 2010 flash crash, or the socially engineered short squeeze of GameStop in 2021.
Whether it is a cab driver buying at the absolute peak of a bubble in 1929, or a high-frequency trading algorithm panic selling into a void in a fraction of a millisecond, the underlying phenomenon remains stubbornly, terrifyingly identical. It is the crowd under acute stress, abandoning reason and moving entirely on primitive instinct.
This forces us to confront a final, profound pushback regarding Le Bon's 1895 text. Is the book itself truly dangerous, as it is so often characterized by critics? Or is that the wrong framework entirely? Perhaps the book is completely neutral. Perhaps it is merely a perfectly polished, objective mirror, reflecting the inescapable biological wiring of our species.
The debate over the nature of that mirror is perhaps the most vital contemplation the essay provokes. A mirror possesses no inherent morality. It cannot be held responsible for the reflection it casts back at you. In the hands of a totalitarian dictator, it serves as a precise, devastating operating manual for societal subjugation.
In the hands of a Madison Avenue executive, it becomes a sophisticated textbook for the silent, continuous extraction of wealth from the consumer. In the hands of a financial operator like Baruch, it is an analytical tool for risk management and immense personal profit.
And yet, for the psychoanalyst trying to save a colleague or the high school teacher in Palo Alto trying to educate his students, it functions as a desperate diagnostic tool. It provides a means to understand, and perhaps briefly halt, the overwhelming tide of collective unreason.
The framework itself remains stoically, coldly indifferent to the purposes of the operator. The terrifying reality you must grapple with is that the levers of affirmation, repetition, and contagion engage with absolute mechanical precision, regardless of whether the prevailing temperature of the crowd is rising toward an act of profound political liberation or an act of unspeakable violent atrocity.
The mechanism is a permanent fixture of the human condition, woven into the very fabric of our biology. And that permanence leaves the modern reader holding a deeply unsettling set of questions about their own autonomy. As you navigate an information architecture that amplifies these levers by orders of magnitude inconceivable to the totalitarian operators of the 1930s, you must ask if the sovereign, rational mind can truly be sustained.
The essay suggests that the only available defense, however fragile, is the small, private discipline of actively noticing the levers as they engage upon you. You must develop the daily, rigorous habit of observing the affirmation when it appears on your screen, recognizing the repetition when it echoes in your digital surroundings, and actively resisting the comforting, intoxicating warmth of the contagion when the crowd beckons you to join.
It is a lonely, exhausting intellectual endeavor requiring constant vigilance against the deepest biological instincts of our species. You must recognize that while the technology of transmission has evolved into a hyper-efficient, inescapable digital web, the human animal responding to the stimulus remains entirely unchanged since Gustave Le Bon watched the barricades burn in the streets of Paris in 1871.
To conclude our investigation and leave you with the author's final reflections, I will now read the epilogue. By the time I closed the book at the small restaurant on the far side of the bazaar, the sun had reached the western edge of the plaza, and the long shadows of the plane trees were feeling their way back across the cobbles toward the fountain. The water was still going up. The children had gone home. A man in a white shirt was crossing the square with a melon under his arm. The book had taken me by a route I had not expected to travel. From a Paris paperback of 1895 to the consulting room at Berghaus 19, through the Roman balcony and the Zeppelin field, and the Easter parade on Fifth Avenue and the Wall Street of October 1929, into the algorithmic markets of the present moment, and back, again and again, to the cool clinical description of what the human collective does when the suggestive temperature of its situation rises. I had thought I was reading 19th century French popular sociology. I had been reading instead the operating conditions of the 20th century and of the one I happen to be sitting in. Take the book down. Read it slowly. You notice as you read the levers that are operating on you in your own situation, in your own week, in the messages on the device in your pocket. The book will not save you from being moved. It will only let you see while you are being moved that you are being moved.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you have enjoyed this investigation, and stay tuned for our next episode.